Hola y bienvenidos. En esta lección vamos a seguir con nuestro análisis del pretérito y del imperfecto. No vamos a trabajar más con la conjugación de estos tiempos verbales, sino que vamos a analizar en qué situaciones debemos usar cada uno de estos dos tiempos verbales. La idea que tengo es que vamos a practicar para poder distinguir bien cuándo es necesario el pretérito y cuándo es mejor usar el imperfecto. Vamos a ver, por ejemplo, qué pasa cuando una acción en el pasado interrumpe otra acción que está en progreso. Después, vamos a trabajar brevemente con el verbo haber en el pretérito y en el imperfecto. Y en la última sección de esta séptima lección voy a hablar de las dos novelas más importantes en la historia de la literatura en español. ¿Entendieron todo de mi introducción? Just in case there's something you didn't follow, let me introduce you to the new vocabulary you just heard. Repeat these new words as you look at their meanings. El análisis, analizar, distinguir, el progreso, progresar, en progreso, interrumpir, breve, brevemente, la sección, la novela, la literatura. You'll notice that cognates are often more obvious in written than in spoken form. And pretty much all of these new words are cognates. And let me add that as I was preparing the introduction for this lecture, I wasn't consciously working to include new words that would all be cognates. It just worked out that way because English and Spanish share so many words that are the same or similar in the two languages. Let me make clear that three of those words, el progreso, progresar, and breve, were not actually in my introduction, but I've included them among the new vocabulary because they'll help you better understand the expression en progreso and the adverb brevemente. How many of the new words did you guess correctly when you heard them the first time? I hope you were thinking about context, cognates, and conjecture to help you work to understand as much as you could. If so, bien hecho, well done. So there's another new word, hecho. It's the past participle of the verb hacer. And we'll be talking about past participles soon for two reasons. First, we'll see them used as adjectives. Later, we'll be learning a verb tense that uses the past participle. For now, it's enough to know that as an adjective, hecho means done or made. De hecho, in fact, you might have seen this word on a product that says hecho en Mexico, made in Mexico. And as an adjective, hecho, of course, must agree in number and gender with the noun being modified. So to say, for example, these shirts made in Mexico are expensive, you'd say, estas camisas hechas en Mexico son caras. And as a noun, el hecho means fact or incident. And let me remind you that the expression de hecho, which we saw in the first course, means in fact. So what do we do now? Where do we go from here? Hay dos posibilidades. There are two possibilities. If you understood my introduction in Spanish as you heard it, just continue with the lesson. Time to move forward. If, however, my introduction in Spanish was challenging for you and you didn't quite catch all of it, I recommend you go back to the start of this lesson and listen to it again. Here's why I say that. Now that you've been introduced to the new vocabulary that I use, you'll almost certainly find it easier to make sense of the introduction the second time you hear it. As I mentioned in Spanish, in this 7th lesson, we'll be continuing our work with the 2 past tenses we've learned so far, the preterite and the imperfect. So where are we with those tenses? Well, in lesson 5, we reviewed how to conjugate the preterite and talked about when to use it. And then in our last lesson, I introduced you both to the uses of the imperfect and the way to conjugate it. So you should have a fairly good idea of when to use the preterite and when to use the imperfect. But we're not done with these 2 tenses yet. We know the imperfect tense is used to talk about a past action without a specific reference to when the action began or ended or exactly how long the action took. In fact, if we knew the start, the end, or duration of the action, we'd use the preterite instead of the imperfect. We have seen the imperfect used to describe past conditions or characteristics, to talk about a past action that's in progress, en progreso, to express time and age in the past, and to express a repeated or habitual past action. So let's dive deeper right now with those 2 tenses. And here's why it's important that we do that. After the present tense, which is the most commonly used verb tense in Spanish, the preterite and the imperfect are the verb tenses you'll be using the most. So our work with these tenses is time well spent. You'll hear them used a lot, and you'll use them often when speaking and writing. And it's the same with reading and writing. If you're reading a lot in Spanish, and I hope you are, you'll encounter the preterite and the imperfect all the time. And if you're writing in Spanish, you'll likewise need a very good grasp of when to use the preterite and when to use the imperfect. When we communicate with others, we tend to talk about past events quite often, which is why we use these 2 past tenses so much. Let me start this discussion by talking about one context in which the use of these 2 verb tenses makes clear what each tense expresses. Let's consider the following situation. A certain action is in progress, and think about which tense we'll use to express this action. When another action interrupts it, and we'll need a different past tense to express this interrupting action. I could say, for example, I was studying when Alberto called me. So, which past tense will we use to say, I was studying? Is it a completed past action or one that's in progress? Well, I was studying describes a past action that's in progress, so to express it, we'll use the imperfect. And what about Alberto called me? Well, that's a completed past action, so it will be expressed with the preterite. So, in Spanish, I was studying when Alberto called me would be yo estudiaba, using the imperfect, cuando Alberto me llamó, using the preterite. Let's look at a few more similar examples. How would you say, my friends arrived when we were eating? Once again, we need to determine which past tense to use for each of those verbs. My friends arrived expresses a completed past action, so it's expressed using the preterite. We were eating, on the other hand, is a past action that's in progress, so it's expressed using the imperfect. So, my friends arrived when we were eating would be mis amigos llegaron cuando comíamos. Here's another. How would you say, I was going for a walk when I heard the news? That would be yo paseaba cuando oí las noticias. So this kind of sentence that expresses an action in progress that is then interrupted by another action helps us become accustomed to the different uses of the imperfect and preterite. As we continue talking about interrupted past actions, I'd like to interrupt here to introduce some new vocabulary that you'll find useful in this current context. Repitan. Pronto, de pronto, de repente. Pronto can mean soon or quickly, and the expression de pronto is a synonym of the expression de repente, Both mean suddenly. How would you say, Anna was walking to her office when it suddenly began to rain? Okay, let's look at this in two parts. First, Anna was walking to her office is clearly an action that's in progress. In Spanish, it would be Ana caminaba a su oficina. When it suddenly began to rain, in Spanish is cuando de repente empezó a llover, or cuando de pronto empezó a llover. And notice that we're using the preterite here to talk about the beginning of a past action. The moment when de repente, de pronto, suddenly it began to rain. Let's look at one more example. How would you say, they were analyzing the problem while I was sleeping? That would be, ellos analizaban el problema mientras yo dormía. So that, in fact, de hecho, was not one action interrupting another. Instead, it was two past actions in progress simultaneously. They were analyzing, I was sleeping, so we use the imperfect for both. Just trying to keep you on your toes. Let's look at one more example of multiple things happening in the past. And when I say look, I really mean look in this case. What I'd like you to do is watch what I do and what happens to me. Then I'm going to ask you to explain what happened. And before I begin, here's a quick vocabulary note. The word to shout in Spanish is repitan, gritar. Otra vez, gritar. Bien. ¿Están listos? Bien. Mírenme.
Professor Worden.
¿Qué pasó? Pues díganme, ¿qué acaba de ocurrir? Pues el profesor leía cuando alguien gritó su nombre y el profesor se levantó. We express what was in progress with the imperfect, leía, and then use the preterite to talk about the two past actions that were completed, gritó and se levantó. Buen trabajo. Now, I'd like to talk about a specific verb that also does a good job demonstrating the differences between these two past tenses. The verb haber, which we know means to have. We're quite accustomed to using the word I, meaning there is, there are, in the present. And we know that I is used with both singular and plural nouns. In the singular, I can say, hay un problema aquí, or I could use a plural noun and say, for example, hay muchos estudiantes en la clase. Let's consider haber used in the preterite and in the imperfect. You might remember that to say there was or there were in the preterite, you say hubo. And haber in the imperfect is había. Both hubo and había get translated into English as there was or there were. But the two verb tenses talk about the past in entirely different ways. Consider first the preterite form of hubo. We know the preterite's used to express a completed past action, so if I use hubo, there must have been some action that occurred. Here are two examples of what I'm talking about. Hubo un accidente en la autopista. La semana pasada hubo elecciones en Bolivia. And let me point out that in the singular, the word la elección typically means choice, though it can mean election in the sense of a vote. Most often, the plural form of las elecciones is used to refer to the process of voting. So what happened in our first sentence? Well, there was an accident. How awful, cars collided, metal was strewn about the highway. We can hope no one was hurt. If you were there when it happened, you could have seen the accident because it's an event that occurred. It's the same in our second sentence about the elections that were held in Bolivia. That's another past action that happened. So we use the preterite form hubo to talk about this event that occurred in the past. As for the imperfect form of había, it's not used to express a completed past action. Instead, it's used to describe the existence of someone or something, not to narrate an action that occurred. Consider these examples. Había muchos cubanos en el parque. Solo había una librería en la ciudad. Unlike hubo, which expresses something that happened in the past, había expresses the idea that there existed something or someone. The Cubans didn't happen, they were just there in the park. Likewise, the bookstore didn't happen, it just existed in the city. Muy bien. That's all we'll do for the moment with our two past tenses. We've spent a fair amount of time in this lesson working with vocabulary and grammar to help you improve your ability to communicate in Spanish. And you've got more practice ahead of you in the workbook and the speaking activities. But for the rest of this lesson, I'd like to change focus from your command of Spanish to a cultural topic, but one that also deals with language. I'll be talking to you about the written word, and I'm going to be discussing one literary genre in particular, the novel, which in Spanish is, repitan, la novela. Specifically, I'm going to talk about the two most important novels ever written in Spanish. And why? Because as students of the language and of the cultures of the Spanish-speaking world, it's important that you be introduced to these two brilliant and timeless literary works. Let me begin by giving you some context for this discussion of literature. If we were talking about poetry or theater, for example, there would be many candidates for the most important poem or play, which makes sense because there have been centuries of poets and playwrights writing many exceptional works of poetry and theater in Spanish. There have also, of course, been many novels written in Spanish. But when discussing the literary genre of the novel, there's pretty much universal agreement among readers and literary critics regarding which are the two most important, influential, and, I'll just come out and say it, best novels ever written in the Spanish language. One was the work of a Spanish author in the 17th century, and the other was written by a Latin American writer in the 20th century. The Latin American writer is the great Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Colombian author who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1982. And his novel, published in 1967, is Cien Años de Soledad, 100 Years of Solitude. In a future lesson, I'll talk about Garcia Marquez in general and Cien Años de Soledad in particular. Right now, I'd like to talk about a Spanish writer born in 1547 in Alcalá de Henares, outside Madrid, and the novel that made him famous. Quick side note. In this discussion, I'll be introducing you to several new nouns related to writing. Each time you hear me say a new word in Spanish, you should repeat it along with the indefinite or definite article that precedes it. Okay, back to our biographical sketch. So, the writer, el escritor, is Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, one of 7 children born in a family of very modest means. Because of financial difficulties, the Cervantes family moved often during Miguel's childhood, from Alcalá de Henares to Valladolid, Córdoba, Sevilla, and finally Madrid. Beyond the lack of money, which was a constant problem for him, Miguel suffered a series of hardships during his life. As a soldier in 1571, in the Battle of Lepanto, off the coast of Greece, he was shot several times on his left side and lost the ability to use his left arm. Thereafter, he was known as El Manco de Lepanto, the one-armed man of Lepanto. In 1575, as he was sailing from Naples back to Spain, his ship was captured by Barbary pirates. As a result, Miguel spent 5 years as a captive in Algiers. When he was finally released, he returned to Spain, but he had trouble finding work. He eventually took a position as a tax collector for the Spanish Armada, a quite difficult job, and he was imprisoned several times because of irregularities in his accounts. But his life is more than just military and financial matters, because Cervantes was also an author, un autor. He lived in an age when being a writer in Spain meant, first and foremost, being a poet, un poeta. After poetry, la poesía. The second most esteemed literary genre of the time was drama, el drama. Cervantes was a good but not great poet. He also wrote works of theater, but they were not much appreciated by his contemporaries. In fact, he couldn't find theatrical troupes, and there were many in Spain during his lifetime, interested in producing his plays. So what's a writer to do if he tries his hand at poetry and theater with very limited success? Well, I suppose he turns to prose, la prosa. At the age of 38, Cervantes produced a prose work about shepherds, a genre that was popular at the time. His book, named after its protagonist and titled La Galatea, was considered a work, una obra. That was fine, but its publication brought no great recognition to our author. So why am I talking about such an unremarkable writer 4 centuries after his death? Because at the age of 58, quite old indeed in the 17th century, Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra published a book titled El ingenioso hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha. And it is Don Quixote, an odd work of prose in an age that privileged poetry and drama, that is destined to change the course of literary history. Cervantes' novel recounts the adventures of a crazy 50-year-old gentleman named Alonso Quijano, who decides to become a knight-errant in an age when there are no more knights, along with his none-too-bright neighbor, Sancho Panza, whom he convinces to accompany him as his squire. Ostensibly, the book was written as a parody of a literary genre that had been quite popular in the 16th century in both Spain and other European countries, the Book of Chivalry. The protagonist of Don Quixote is a man with a keen interest in reading these chivalric tales, fantastic adventures of knights who live in magical worlds and take it upon themselves to challenge evildoers, battle giants when necessary, and defend those in need of assistance, especially damsels in distress, all with the purpose of making the world a safer place while gaining glory and honor for themselves through their exploits. Unlike the heroes of the books that he reads, however, Alonso Quijano is not young, strong, handsome, or even particularly noble. He was un hidalgo, a word we currently translate as nobleman or gentleman, but, and this is part of Cervantes' parody of books of chivalry, whose protagonists were princes and kings, hidalgos were the very lowest level of nobility. Nevertheless, our protagonist makes it his mission to fight evil in the world while serving his love, the imagined Dulcinea. While the knights errant he reads about reside in places considered magical and exotic by Spanish readers in the 16th century, like Constantinople, Greece, England, Don Quixote seeks adventure in the Spanish province of La Mancha, the most boring region in Spain. Why is it boring? Well, it's sparsely populated, has a landscape that lacks charm, and suffers greatly in comparison to the important city of Madrid to its north and the fascinating region of Andalusia to its south. Let me add that I once apologized to a friend of mine from La Mancha, saying that I felt bad that when teaching Don Quixote, I describe his province as a spectacularly uninteresting place. My Manchegan friend responded, "Está bien, Bill. Tienes razón. La Mancha es una región muy aburrida." The most famous episode of the work, of course, is the one in which the protagonist attacks the windmills, thinking they're giants. This is the moment when Sancho famously asks his master, ¿Qué gigantes? Don Quixote later battles sheep, convinced that they're armies, and throughout the work remains unable to distinguish between the prosaic world that surrounds him in La Mancha from the fantastic one described in the exotic locales of his beloved books of chivalry. After its initial publication in 1605, Don Quixote became quite popular for a time in Spain and elsewhere. In fact, the first translation appears in England in 1612. In 1615, Cervantes published a sequel to his original work that continued the adventures of knight and squire. Many modern readers, in fact, think of Don Quixote as just one book, the first part with giants and armies. In fact, it's a novel in two parts, published 10 years apart. And the second part is, for many readers, even better than the first. In the 1615 work, for example, Don Quixote encounters characters who know of him because they've read the 1605 work. In 1616, at the age of 68, our author dies in Spain just 11 days before the death of William Shakespeare in England. As the 17th century continues on without Cervantes, his work was never actually forgotten, but achieved the status of a curious, funny book, perhaps worth a read for its comic value, but not destined to have much effect on the literature of Spain, much less that of other countries. Centuries later, the influence of Don Quixote has become resoundingly clear. It is hailed by many critics as the first modern novel, while Cervantes has become for Spain what Shakespeare is for England, a source of national pride and an author acknowledged as an inspiration for generations of subsequent writers. So what happened? Why did this odd work written early in the 17th century attain the status of a literary classic? What changed was, quite simply, that writers in the 18th and especially the 19th century began writing lots and lots of novels. And when these writers went looking for the origins of their genre, they turned to Don Quixote. To note just a few of the numerous tributes paid by later novelists, Daniel Defoe acknowledged the quixotism of Robinson Crusoe. Gustave Flaubert commented, "I trace my origins to the book that I knew by heart before I learned how to read, Don Quixote." Dostoevsky proclaimed, "A more profound and powerful work than this one is not to be met with. It is the final and the greatest utterance of the human mind." In the mid-20th century, literary critic Lionel Trilling famously asserted, "All prose fiction is a variation on the theme of Don Quixote." In 2002, the Nobel Institute, along with the Book Club of Norway, asked 100 well-known writers to vote for the best work of fiction ever written. The novel they chose by an enormous margin was Don Quixote. Though the work is celebrated by readers and critics, no single interpretation of the novel holds sway. Readers in Spain in the 17th century saw Don Quixote as a purely comical character. Many of the German literary critics of the 19th century saw the knight as a noble figure, worthy of emulation. Dostoevsky considered the novel the saddest story ever told. When he was teaching at Harvard, the Russian novelist Vladimir Nabokov didn't want to teach Don Quixote because of what he considered the unnecessary cruelty with which Cervantes treated his protagonist. So who's right? How should we interpret the most famous novel ever written? I recommend that you read Don Quixote so you can decide for yourself. I'd like to end this lesson by quoting the most well-known line in all of Spanish literature, the first sentence of the first chapter of the first part of Don Quixote, which begins in this way. En un lugar de la Mancha. In a place in La Mancha. Please repeat these most famous words. En un lugar de la Mancha. If you do read Cervantes' masterpiece, those words will begin a fantastic adventure you'll take along with Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. And you'll be following the example of innumerable readers over the past 4 centuries who have delighted in reading El ingenioso hidalgo Don Quixote de la Mancha. Hasta pronto.
Glosario en audio, lección 7.
Give the Spanish for the following English words. Then repeat the Spanish word. Analysis.
El análisis.
To analyze.
Analizar.
To distinguish.
Distinguir.
Progress.
El progreso.
To progress. To make progress.
Progresar.
In progress.
En progreso.
To interrupt.
Interrumpir.
Brief.
Breve.
Briefly.
Brevemente.
Section.
La sección.
Novel.
La novela.
Literature.
La literatura.
Done. Made.
Hecho.
Well done.
Bien hecho.
Fact. Incident.
El hecho.
Soon. Quickly.
Pronto.
Suddenly.
De pronto.
Suddenly.
De repente.
To shout.
Gritar.
Choice. Election.
La elección.
Election.
Las elecciones.
Writer.
El escritor.
One-armed.
Manco.
Author.
El autor.
Poet.
El poeta.
Poetry.
La poesía.
Prose.
La prosa.
Work.
La obra.
Ingenious.
Ingenioso.
Nobleman. Gentleman.
El hidalgo.
Giant.
El gigante. Actividades de conversación. Lección 7.
Give the Spanish for the following English words. Action.
La acción.
Analysis.
El análisis.
To analyze.
Analizar.
Brief.
Breve.
Briefly.
Brevemente.
To describe.
Describir.
To distinguish.
Distinguir.
In progress.
En progreso.
To progress. To make progress.
Progresar.
Progress.
El progreso.
Literature.
La literatura.
Novel.
La novela.
Section.
La sección.
In fact.
De hecho.
Soon. Quickly.
Pronto.
Suddenly.
De pronto.
Suddenly.
De repente.
Listen to the following sentences and decide if they are describing a past action that's completed, a past action that's in progress, or past actions in progress simultaneously. For example,
Él terminó la tarea a las 6 de la tarde.
completed past action.
A las 5 de la tarde yo me estaba bañando.
Past action in progress.
Ismael bailó toda la noche.
Completed past action.
Yo veía las noticias del accidente mientras llamaba a mi madre.
Past actions in progress simultaneously.
Ella me envió 45 mensajes de texto la semana pasada.
Completed past action.
Nosotros dormimos 10 horas anoche.
Completed past action.
Ustedes lloraban mucho mientras miraban la película.
Past actions in progress simultaneously.
Él corría en el parque y se divertía.
Past actions in progress simultaneously.
Patricia llegó tarde a la reunión.
Completed past action.
Mientras cocinábamos la comida, leíamos la receta.
Past actions in progress simultaneously.
Yo analizaba los resultados con mis hermanas.
Past action in progress. Listen to the following conversation and answer the questions that follow.
Ustedes saben que este año hay muchos nuevos estudiantes que quieren aprender español. en este vecindario?
Es cierto. Tienes razón.
El año pasado había menos estudiantes.
La próxima semana, un estudiante de Japón va a estar con nosotros en mi casa.
Ah, muy bien. ¿Por cuánto tiempo?
3 meses.
Creo que podemos hacer algo para reunir a estos estudiantes para darles la bienvenida.
Creo que es buena idea. ¿Pero dónde? ¿Qué piensas, Alejandro?
Podemos primero utilizar el salón de reuniones del vecindario y después jugar al fútbol en el parque. Hace muy buen tiempo ahora.
¿En qué estás pensando, Ricardo?
Una vez estaba en Taiwán porque quería aprender chino. Todos los estudiantes teníamos una reunión. Éramos más de 30 estudiantes. Yo iba a preparar mi propio estilo de arroz frito para llevar a la reunión. Era la primera vez que yo hacía ese arroz. Yo utilicé mucho, pero mucho aceite en el arroz. El arroz sabía horrible y no tenía sal. Al final de la reunión, todos tenían dolor de estómago. Todos se enfermaron ese día. Por eso creo que es mejor tener cuidado con la comida que vamos a preparar en nuestra reunión.
¿Qué quieren aprender los nuevos estudiantes?
Quieren aprender español.
¿De qué nacionalidad es el estudiante que va a estar en la casa de Ricardo?
Es japonés.
¿Cuál es la idea de Alejandro para darles la bienvenida a los estudiantes?
Él quiere hacer una reunión y después jugar al fútbol.
Cuando Ricardo estuvo en Taiwán, ¿qué cocinó para la reunión de estudiantes?
Ricardo cocinó arroz frito.
Listen to the conversation again if you need to. Then answer the following questions, saying cierto for true and falso for false. El año pasado había muchos estudiantes.
Falso. El año pasado había menos estudiantes.
Ricardo quería aprender chino en Taiwán.
Cierto.
El estudiante japonés va a estar en la casa de Ricardo por 6 meses.
Falso. Va a estar en su casa por 3 meses.
A Bill le parece mala idea hacer una reunión para los estudiantes.
Falso. Le parece una buena idea.
Ricardo utilizó mucha sal en el arroz frito.
Falso. Ricardo no tenía sal.
En Taiwán, todos se enfermaron con el arroz que preparó Ricardo.
Cierto.
Alejandro opina que hace buen tiempo para jugar al fútbol.
Cierto.